the School of Human Ecology itself is peculiar in that there is little by way of thematic unity. But there is commonality of perspective, right? We are interested in, first, a holistic and interdisciplinary analysis of social natural concerns, and second, in spaces that have been of scant interest so far to scholarly research, although it is an emerging area or spaces of interest, as we've just seen today. For the choice of our plenary speaker, therefore, we wish to invite someone who looks at environment-society relations holistically in this manner, and can help us collectively to zoom out and reflect on the larger processes, patterns, agents and contestations that are playing out contemporarily. Nitin is well suited to such a reflective exercise. As a senior journalist, he straddles several worlds. Those or that where policy is created, where regional political agendas are fleshed out, but also where these matters hit the ground. He's especially well positioned to comment on the way environmental concerns have been understood, articulated, and acted upon in state spaces over the last 15 or so years through his work with publications such as Down to Earth, The Times of India, The Hindu, and now with the Business Standard, where he's currently an associate editor. And if you do follow this field, which I'm hoping as graduate students of human ecology you do, you would have come across Nitin's articles, very, very pressing these days, on the sorts of things that are going on with the regime change in terms of larger legal dynamics within which development is located and within which ecologies and environments are being reconfigured. Without going any further, I invite Nitin to please address the gathering.
Thank you for having me here. I was a bit worried when I got the invite from Asmita to begin with, because usually it's the journalists who listen to the academics and not the other way around. I was slightly more comfortable when I heard it's after lunch, because I presumed all you wanted to hear was about 400 words, which is what most journalists are capable of writing on a good day. Unlike you guys who bring out large documents that most of us are incapable of reading and produce something out of it by the end of the day. So another tactic that journalists very usually deploy to get away on such occasions is to have bluster, throw large numbers, perhaps one or two anecdotes, because we move around within circles of power. It always enamors others when you hear about what does this minister really do, what does that guy really do, and usually get away without actually having anything of principal value to provide. So I shall attempt that over 40 minutes today. I was asked to give a phrase which suited an academic setting like this, so I provided this, but I'll try and deviate from it as much with your permission as well. To begin with, the big numbers, which I hope dazzle you or put you to sleep in the next 3 minutes, thereafter you can not bother about the rest, is I looked at the work. I was sent a list of work that you people have done, master students I think have done in the past year or two, and it's pretty much very microscopic in the sense you go down deep into a certain area, a certain segment, inspect it, verify it, in some ways question even your own, as I was speaking to a couple of the people today, even question your own initial questions that you have. Journalists do not have that freedom most often. We've got about half a day to come back with a question and an answer which seems completely solid, complete, and full on. And live with the fact that we knew nothing while we said this is the true fact. But some things are very simple to find. Everyone seems to repeat the same. So I'll start with those. And the larger picture that I work under, while as he was saying, most of our daily reporting and writing is about the small shenanigans of people in power. How do they play with these issues about development, environment? How do files get cleared? How does somebody clear a project or not clear a project? How does someone assess how important environment is in a certain area? How does it get plugged into actually decision making? Sometimes it's good to step back and say, while there are lots of these small incidents happening which are politically very important to report and read and write about as academics and as people in public space to begin with, there are large dynamics which we very often forget spaces about. On the large dynamics that I look at very often when I cover issues around climate change is energy itself. What are India's demands on energy? Where are we progressing? How much more do we need? What kind of energy we need? How essential is it? And how does it link to where we stand as an economy at a macro scale today? So to give you some ballpark figures, which I'm sure half of you already know, but just to set it off, we are the 4th largest consumers of energy. We're one of the biggest importers of energy at the moment. So much so that if we increase our demand by about 0.5%, the cost of oil goes up by around $10 immediately. That's how big an economy we are. The moment we put in a demand saying tomorrow we want to buy more oil, the entire global market shines up saying, oh look, there's a new market available. We're that big. And yet at the same time, we're very energy poor. I mean, these are numbers that you must have seen when you were doing your graduation or masters perhaps, but to go back to them, at the levels of energy we consume, we are, I think, about 1/10 of what is consumed by the US, if I'm not mistaken. And please do verify facts. Again, remember, I'm a journalist, so whatever facts I throw at you, you have the liberty of going back and checking with Google, because that's what I did. So we are about 1/10 in terms of consumption of energy of the US. We're about 1/6. Actually, we're about 1/20th of US, if I'm not mistaken, about 1/6 of China on a per capita energy consumption basis. We're about 1/10 of Europe. We're about 2/3 of Indonesia. We're about 1/3 of Brazil. And we're about 1/4 of South Africa. Now, it's good to compare yourself with people that you normally like to sit on the table with. And India likes to claim it's an emerging economy, so we like to sit on table with what are called emerging economies. Typically Brazil, South Africa, China, Indonesia, these are the big guns in supposedly these days. So we sit along with them and we feel very happy about it. But that's where we are. We're below all of these countries when we look at our energy consumption. And this per capita basis literally turns out to how it impacts our lives. So if you look at it in another way, the same numbers translate into the fact that about 300 million people in India right now have not seen electricity ever in their lives, in their households. They literally don't have any bulb in their houses. And these are government numbers. If you interrogated these numbers, you'll find out another 200 million that supposedly have a line drawn over their village actually do not have a bulb in their house either, or they've only seen a light for about half an hour or 2 hours a day. Now, most of you gone to field, perhaps have seen this anyway in the villages that you worked in or areas that you worked in. Even peri-urban areas of Delhi, you'll find there's at least in Delhi, even today, there are around 4% of the population that does not have electricity. And this is the capital of a country which is the 4th largest economy. And they're going to rejig the numbers in 2 months. We'll be called the 3rd largest economy in next 3 months, surprisingly, just out of juggling numbers. Now, there is a consequence to this. These 300 million people in some way live in energy poverty, which removes them from the possibilities that you and I enjoy, that keeps them at far distance from the opportunities that you and I access like this. And there's a price that they pay for it. The price obviously is that they continue to live in the same levels of poverty for longer than perhaps we would if we had that electricity to begin with. Now, the question is, are we unique? In that sense, is India different than any other countries? All countries have gone through this phase of economic growth at some point or the other and transited into either better economies in pure financial terms or imploded. If you look back, most economies, and this is a fact again that numbers prove, with higher GDP per capita than ours, do much better on the Human Development Index than us. Only about 2% of the countries with lesser per capita incomes do better than us in terms of human development indices. Now, these indices are very basic. They are not even asking you, it's not really questioning the quality of life. It's just saying basic stuff like, will your children survive when they're born? Almost as simple as that. And most countries seem to do better only when they earn better income. We are not yet at that stage, which to an administrator or a government official automatically converts into, therefore we must earn more. Therefore, you hear this constant theory about development versus environment. Should we have 7% growth or 9% growth? If you take out the numbers and you forget the numbers, generally the principle seems to stand true, that if you have higher income levels, you'll have perhaps higher development levels as well. Now, have countries dissociated their quality of life from the energy levels or the income levels that they have? Is it possible at some point to decouple yourself? Say that your incomes do not grow, but your quality of life continues to grow. And it seems it's possible. but it's only possible at a certain stage of development and a certain stage of your economy. So if you look at European countries, they seem to have a better quality of life, or at least better human development indices than, say, the US. At 1/4 the amount of energy consumption, at 1/4 the type, per capita income levels. But they're still 4 times above us or 6 times above us. But they have been at some point able to achieve the same level of comfort zone that, say, some economies like in the Middle East, which are built on exports of oil, or the US, which is a very highly consumptive society, has achieved only at a certain stage much higher, consuming a lot more. What does that indicate for us? What is therefore unique about us? Because then we're as boring as any other societies in some ways. And I find that, we all feel about ourselves that we are great individuals, we have some individuality about us, but as a society, it seems we are pretty much like everyone else. We've not done any great things after all our great history and stuff. We pretty much reached the same level of economy and questions in society that everyone else did in some different ways. So say South Africa had its issues of apartheid. So on a per capita basis, if you look, you'll find that yes, they are much higher, but the degree of discrimination in a society is so high that almost 70 or 80% of the wealth, if I'm not mistaken, and perhaps 90% of the wealth in South Africa is held by 1% of the population. So the degree of differentiation in South Africa is much higher, which has to do with our historical facts. Now, it's pretty much true in our country also, in our society also, except we've not learned to see it as much. And perhaps that's our uniqueness, is how we've screwed up our society. And as somebody who taught me early on said, that in a good democracy, everyone has the right not only to do the good thing the right way by their own choices, but also screw up yourselves in a unique way. And that's a good democracy, where you get the right to make the wrong choices as well. And we've done that. So in that sense, we're a very vibrant democracy. Well, yes, we are. What we've not done in the meanwhile, that other countries have perhaps been able to achieve, and we don't have to go very far looking for these examples of what countries have achieved that we have not been able to, though we had almost the same resources or perhaps a bit less, a bit more, but on the margin 5 to 7%, I would say. If you look at countries like Nepal and Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, they've been ripped apart by social events. Their political histories are perhaps much more difficult than ours in the contemporary history phases if you look at last 3 decades. If you imagine Nepal, is gone through such tremendous change, they still can't figure out what their constitution is. Yet they seem to have done better on indices of health. Yet they seem to have done better on a distributive economy than we have. You look at Sri Lanka, it's gone through a crazy war period where people have died crudely, badly, and the entire society is ripped apart by conflict. And yet they've done much better than us, though their income levels are slightly higher than India on a per capita basis. But they seem to have achieved something that we haven't been able to. You look at Bangladesh. I mean, we look at Bangladesh, typically North Indian, and this is a North Indian bias, I would admit, as a Punjabi. We think, Bangladesh, poor country. But they seem to be doing well with everything else on the social index, except for per capita incomes. They seem to be managing their society much better, even in middle of complete tumultuousness. And that's very odd. We've got these examples sitting right behind us in countries that politically we've been trying to control for last 3 decades because we believe we are the big brother in South Asia and we should manage their economies for us. So obviously everyone's heard histories of how we manage Nepal. And if someone hasn't, you should read this lovely book by a chap called Prashant Jha, a journalist, a Nepalese journalist who's done this fantastic book, shows how we tried to meddle in Nepalese politics all through last decades and screwed ourselves over it. And yet they came out better after it. So there are examples right in our back door where people seem to be doing much better with much less. There's something wrong in the way we are looking at these things, numbers. So sometimes you'll hear these headlines, which again very often turns into these black and white stories about development versus environment versus growth, etc. But if you actually checked what these stories are basically saying, how do you use your resources? Where do you deploy them? So one way where you've mistaken perhaps in inviting me rather than invite someone else is that when you want to investigate issues about resources, the worst person to call is an environment journalist. Because I've really not looked at the real bit of it, which is who makes money out of it. The best person to tell you this is somebody who's covered the business of these resources. So somebody who's perhaps covered the coal scam is perhaps much better present in understanding how does the coal economy really work? Where does the money go? Who earns out of it? How much power is generated? Why is it generated? Do you really need coal? It's extremely destructive a source of energy. Coal specifically because it's hot, so again I'll stick to it and perhaps enthrall you for 10 minutes on that itself. So this new government's put a new target saying that we'll now produce 100 gigawatts of solar power in the next 4 years. It's a fantastic target. It's fantastic because no country's ever achieved it. It's so fantastic that China smiled when we said this. And they've achieved 12 gigawatts and they said, damn, it was so tough. So we've got this 100 gigawatts target. If you want to guess how much money it will take, on the minimum it will take in the next 3 years, 100 billion US dollars. This is not, if you don't consider the background infrastructure that is required to actually evacuate the solar power out of. So all of us as environmentalists and all of us think we have a bit of that in us. I think especially in the new generation, not in the bearded ones like these. There's a sense that we are all, more attached to environment some way. Renewable has a good sexy terminology around it. Everyone seems very happy when you talk about renewable energy and solar and let's go wind and we won't go for these dirty fuels. But the reality of these fuels is very odd. So say take solar. It's very logical that solar is only produced at a certain part of the day. It can't be produced 24 hours. So if you produce it for only 6 or 8 hours a day, even if you were putting it up in Rajasthan or Gujarat, that's the only time you're actually generating energy. Now the problem is, again, it's a very technological challenge, but it's a challenge that all economies face, is that how do you store this energy? So any one of us, and I think a lot of us would be able to afford UPS at home for battery backups or even for your phones. If you realize the biggest problem with smartphones or backup is that the batteries don't last. Now that's because we do not have a system of storing energy cheaply, condense it very tight, and able to release it when we want. So solar energy and wind energy face this tremendous problem that it has to be evacuated right when it's produced. And you really can't control it. It has to be taken out when it's produced. So if the sun is up, that's when you need it most. You have to take it out at that moment. You can't store it. The moment you store it, the price of energy goes up at current levels by around 20 times. And yet producing solar is a bit costly than coal. So you've got about solar per unit. I think in Delhi we pay around 3 rupees per unit. Before Kejriwal did this thing, we were paying around 3 rupees a unit or 2 rupees 80 a unit. Solar energy costs about 6 rupees a unit to produce on an average. It's been coming down. 2 years ago, it was around 12 rupees a unit. If you stored it, this 6 rupees would turn into around 24 to 30 rupees a unit. Which, I mean, I'm sure everyone realizes that if you're using 200 minimum units a month, none of you would be able to afford it, and your parents would make sure that you never charge your phones ever again. But this is the truth. Now, what do you do if you produce 100 gigawatts of solar? If you produce 100 gigawatts of solar, or you set up a capacity of 100 gigawatts of solar, you actually only produce 20,000 megawatts. Unlike, say, a solar or a coal plant, where it works at almost 90% of its capacity, and if you set up a 1 gigawatt plant, it will produce 80,000 megawatts for you. So you set up $100 billion worth of equipment, which is very good because it's going to save on climate change, but damn it, you only come out to 20,000 megawatts energy. And that also, when it wants to produce itself, it will. You cannot control it. Unlike coal and hydro, where you can switch it on, switch it off whenever you want. You burn more coal, you'll get more energy. If you don't want, you can just shut it off. Same with hydro, you flow more water, you'll get more energy. If you don't, you can almost shut it off. The new systems actually allow you to do this within 5-minute reaction period. So you can't do this with renewable. What do you do then? You have to ensure that for every 10,000 megawatts of renewable that is produced, you have to provide a base of consistent energy, or what everyone calls the base load in the sector. So for every 5,000 megawatts, say, that you produce of a renewable energy form, right now you have to produce another 20,000 megawatts of a base load. Where does this base load come from? Coal and hydro. So you end up again in the same situation. Now, even if India by some means was able to produce 100 gigawatts of solar in the next 5 years, and I hope they do, and somehow they find that 100 billion US dollars, we would still need another 700 billion US dollars to have the infrastructure in place to use that 20,000 megawatts of power that will actually be produced. What does that really mean? In real terms, it means we'll be digging more coal out. In real terms, it means that's the only way to go forward for this country in the next 20, 30 years, till either there's a technological breakthrough and renewables become cheaper, or you can store renewables somewhere cheaper and then take it out, evacuate it when you want. Now, these are tough choices for anyone sitting in government, because if I get elected And I know I can't get elected even if there was only one person in the room trying to elect me. I would never get voted for. But if I was trying to get elected, the only thing I would do, first thing I'd want to do is provide people electricity, water, and food. That's the fundamental that you would produce for anyone. And once you've given that, then you would question, "Aap air pollution se to nahi mar rahe hain?" Because right now, if I'm dying of hunger, really I'm not bothered about in the long run if my lungs will die of air pollution. These are large questions that any administrator, anyone in position of power has to face, and it's a real fact. It's a sad fact in some sense, because these are difficult choices to make, but these are the choices that somebody sitting in position of power has to make. Now, what does it mean if he has to dig out more coal? Roughly at the moment, the government is trying to auction, if I'm not mistaken, around 43 new coal blocks, and in the next 10 years, about 200 new coal blocks. We'll dig out more coal in the next 20 years than we produced in the last 100 years. We'll open up more mining areas in the next 10 years than we've opened up roughly in the last 70 years. We've cut down in the last 10 years more forests for mining and extractive activities than we've extracted in the last 50 years of since independence roughly, I think. And yet, it does not satiate even our basic needs at some point of time. It still does not ensure that every one of us gets the electricity that is a base minimum that anyone should require as a human being, or the standards that we set for ourselves as human beings. But then it seems very easy. Then all of us who are talking about environment in some ways are being myopic and only looking at it from one point of view. We've not seen the other side of this debate. Then there are these less sexier things that have to be done to perhaps resolve these issues. Issues that most of us as environmentalists also very often ignore because they're tough. They're rather, how would I say, they're boring stuff to do. But things that a government requires to do. Say, if you have solar energy in Rajasthan and Gujarat, you need to evacuate this. So you prioritize and say, build the grid on that side of the country rather than build it where it already exists. You start looking at transmission losses. You suddenly find questions which connect to scams and say, why is the gas price in India the costliest? There are issues. We could shift to gas instead of coal. Why are we not producing gas? So suddenly these things which are only existing in our time frames and mind frames as scams actually end up being the resource challenges that we face. The fact that gas at the moment, even after the pricing at 5.4 or whatever we've done at the moment for Reliance, is one of the costliest possibles at what's called the gate level, in sense from where it just runs off. It's one of the costliest after Qatar, I think, and Qatar is the cheapest because they have huge reserves. Then you end up in these questions about where is this distribution system gone wrong? And this is not a question that on an average day, we as people who engage with issues of environment and resources like to engage with because they're really dirty stuff. This is where the dirt occurs. Who manages these resources? How do we bid out these resources? What is the mechanism by which we say who should take out, how much, at what price, and give to whom? How do I prioritize? I have gas. I need it for Delhi because Delhi, if you remember, runs on LPG and CNG. So there's a gas plant close by. 10 years ago, we decided to shift out of coal because obviously in Delhi, we couldn't afford coal. It would be too dirty for every one of us, the upper middle class of India in some sense. But our gas plant has been remaining shut because the prices are so high. So the priority could be that you could provide it to public sector gas plants. You could give it to private vehicles. You could give it to public transport vehicles. Then you could give it to the fertilizer sector, which also requires gas to produce fertilizer for the agrarian economy. So you have this much gas. You have at the moment 2 producers, and you have these many demands on it. It's a default setting for corruption in some ways, because you have an oligarchy in place. You have 2 people who command the entire economy, or 2 setups who command the entire economy. So the real question I would say as an environmentalist that I need to ask myself is, how do we set up a mechanism where these things are distributed more openly, evenly, and fairly? Which brings in questions of equity, fairness, and if you turn them into business language, you're saying, is the tender done openly? Do we know what decisions are taken in the government? This is where I do my little bit of job saying, oh, this paper was not in public domain, I bring it out and become a hero by bringing it out in public domain. But that's the little puny thing I do. But the real questions lie behind that. And these are the questions in some way, I think, you as academics explore. at very different levels. Sometimes you explore it from a very micro perspective of saying, as someone, Suresh was talking to me about saying, you know, what happens when an area gets destroyed by mining and somebody wants to reconstruct it? What do the people really want out of that area? What do the people want to see back in that place? As he was saying, his student found that they didn't really want to find the old forest back or the old habitations back. They wanted a new economy built out of it. They had changed in the same time for good reasons. They wanted cash. They were coming to the cities. They need health treatment. They need to send the children to schools. It's all a cash economy which didn't exist earlier. They're looking for a different format of life as well. As researchers, I think you have the luxury, in a sense, a responsibility to investigate these questions. Investigate these questions at a very small level, perhaps to begin with, but keep these large pictures in mind. So very often I know, and this is, it's very evident in the recent Delhi elections, of how the anger and the impatience of a rising community has brought out a new leader in some sense, a new political force in some sense. It's brought in a certain degree, it's come out of a certain degree of impatience in the society of how our politics is changing and whether it's changing very slowly or fast. So you've got this completely, a leader that looks relatively much cleaner than all the others. Now, how does the political economy in that sense play? It runs on the fact that there's going to be elections, that elections have to be invested upon, that elections cost money, and eventually you find leaders who have to repay the cost that they underwent when they ran for the election. So if I borrowed a standard member of parliament election, I would say, if I ballpark figure, which you can never quote and I never said, but if you quoted, say, in Haryana or somewhere, an election of a member of parliament costs anything between 8 to 10 crores. Now, obviously, it's been borrowed from somewhere. There's a return of investment that has to be given. An average business in India runs on a 6 to 7% rate of return. So obviously, if he's taken 8 crores, he's got to pay back that much amount of money in the 5 years that he or she is in power. There's an entire economy built on this democratic system that we have. And it's yet one of the most robust democracies available at the day. It's a democracy that withstood a lot of time. It's also a democracy that very often has withstood attempts to change it, even change it for good. And sometimes it's kind of fallen prey to these changes and churned itself over. So I would say some of the changes that you see, and you will never relate them with issues of environmentalism, social development, etc. on an average day, but issues that are very important. Perhaps the churning of politics in Uttar Pradesh over the last decade and Bihar over the last decade. The arrival of the new castes in positions of power that you never saw them before. The fact that there was this huge politics, I don't know, maybe you were too young at that time, but newspapers were full of these stories that we're back in with the Bihar elections about Mandal versus Kamandal. Can you create a new caste formation setup which helps a minister come or a electorate chap come to Delhi? Or can caste be overcome by playing the religious card to create a new monolith of society? Or in case of Delhi, can you create roughly a class divide between the rich and the not so rich? And can you use that to catapult yourself into political space? Now in UP has gone through this churning. You've seen a Dalit chief minister, a woman Dalit chief minister who came into power by actually making life of BJP at that time extremely miserable, almost decimated the party at one point of time, simply by consolidating the votes of the scheduled castes and others, took over power. Before that, if you remember, it was the Yadavs which had taken over. Now, if you think of Yadavs in some sense, in ecological sense, and this is an anecdote that Lalu Prasad Yadav once came to a colleague of mine. He said, so he was asking, what does, Lalu ji, aap kya hain? So he said, in Bihar's ecology, and this is what he said in Hindi, in Bihar's ecology, I'm the man between the forest and the agricultural space. I'm the chap who runs away stealing into the forest, and I know the forest as well as the agricultural space. Nobody comes after me there. And when I need to trade with the agriculturists, I come back to the kheti and make money out of it, because I'm the guy who takes the cow from the field into the forest to eat into the forest because it's free. I'm the guy who tendered these trade-offs for society. So Yadavs at some point for Bihar ecology, this is the way he explains, perhaps wrongly or rightly, but this is the way he saw Yadavs at one point in society over there, the middle spaces. And the middle spaces took over the politics, ran it for 10 years, and then ran to ground because another Yadav came up and said, this is enough. We've now reached the point where we've become more economically strong than the others. There's another community which is not. So the Dalits came to fore. somebody realized you can create a niche out of the Dalits itself. And why not so? They were the poorest, so you had this new creation called the Mahadalits. You break the Dalit vote also into small vote banks, create a mix of Mahadalits, another minority, the Muslims, and a third minority, bring them together and you realize actually they're 45% of the population. And they win. So these dynamics are not about really just caste dynamics in some sense. They're really about resource dynamics. Who controls state's resources? Who controls power in these places? Who takes the decisions? Another fascinating thing that I learned traveling early in UP was, if you remember, now it's become common parlance that you saw all these Ambedkar statues in different places in Uttar Pradesh. For our middle class, upper caste aesthetics, we found them very strange. We thought they really didn't look like Ambedkar very often. They were built crudely. And I was speaking to one of the ideologues of the movement at that time. This guy was, on behalf of the party, asked to build these statues wherever you find scheduled caste communities living. I said, why did you build these? How does it really help you? He says, one is obviously simple. It helps us consolidate. It shows we have a place in society. We occupy a certain geography. And he says, and then he gave me an example which I never believed he would know. He says, do you know how the Ulfa movement in Assam started? And I said, no, really. I've been to Assam. I've worked in Northeast for a little while, but not followed the history so well. He said, the first few people who were trained from the Alpha went over to across the border to the other side, were trained with explosives, small guns, not SLRs, but at that time 303s, etc., given a few little arsenal and sent back saying, now you do whatever you want to. They were trained in a certain Marxist ideology at that time. Now, what was the first thing they did when they came back to Assam? For 6 months, their only target was bomb all the Nehru busts that were put up all across Assam. Just keep a small bomb under all the Nehru statues in Assam, and they found out there were 263 of them in a little state called Assam. Just bomb them off because it showed they were in command, that it was their society, it was not Nehru's society. The iconism of how do you occupy space socially and therefore over resources consequently is an important play in society in general. We don't, as environmentalists, very often track that as well. We often forget that we are deeply entrenched, divided society. We still track and live and thrive on our caste system so intensely that most often we ignore it. Because for most of us, at least the elites, it works very well in our favor. To give you an example, and I'm not blaming you, if you look at media itself, this was a survey done by CSDS, a good think tank based in Rajpur Road. 96% of all editors were upper caste in India. And this is English and Hindi media. All associate editor level, where I am, 89% of them were all upper caste. This is 60 years after independence. We form roughly around 18% of the population. Yet we represented 90% of the public sphere where opinion making happens. There's something wrong with the society where after 60 years you've not reformed that space. There's something inherently difficult in that society about how we see ourselves, how we don't understand that we are privileged societies. So let me give you another example, and this is again when I come to the anecdotes bit before I finish off, because I can see a few people nod on this now. So yesterday I was sitting in a meeting because the budget is coming on, so some of the biggest economists, think tank guys were coming to our paper, sitting with us saying what will happen out of the budget, what do you need to write, etc. And then one senior bureaucrat who had not name out of, again, shame, sat next to it, discussed, issues about poverty, what Modi government can do, how it will change tax, and then in the middle of all this, just turned around and said, yaar, ye batao, ye Aadhaar card banega kya mera? So, because he looked at me because I'm in a business paper, so I'm relatively looked at as, I call myself the Kutta Billi Ghas Foos reporter. I'm not the hard economic reporter for them, but they treat me well, nevertheless. So he looked at me because he thought I am the one who deals with all these issues. So I said, haan, ban jayega, it doesn't take too much. It'll take 10 minutes of work and, perhaps you don't, considering who you are, you don't even need to go to any place, you'll get it home. I said, but why do you really need it? I mean, Aadhaar basically gives you a sense of identity. So for migrant labor and others, it's very important. It gives you a sense of security कि police वाला आएगा तो बोल तो सकते हो हम कौन हैं. Then really not looking most often for things out of it except for an identity. So it's like, why you living in Lutyens, Delhi, in a 4-bedroom house require an Aadhaar card? He said, मेरा LPG gas का subsidy बंद हो जाएगा. And I really looked at him and I said, you, I mean, a secretary of the government of India earning 80,000 a month, which roughly in the case of a government officer turns around to into 3 lakhs a month, was still looking for subsidy on a gas cylinder. So I looked at him and I said, sir, but really? Like, do you need it? I said, nahi. I said, then? Kyun nahi? And I said, okay. And what do you do to that? When someone says, nahi chahiye, fir bhi chahiye. You cannot even argue with him. So I smiled at him. I said, I'll get it done for you. But maybe you should think once. So he looked at me and said, are you being condescending? So my editor was sitting right next to me and is a good friend of the bureaucrat. So I said, yes. He said, acha chodo fir. But imagine, this is a super elite in the most powerful places in India. And a person who still cannot see where he's privileged and how privileged he's in society. And if you look back, all of us somehow are guilty of all this. We've forgotten how privileged we are in the society at the moment. It's very difficult. I mean, I stay too often. Unlike you guys, I have to stay in this Lutyens zone too often because this is where we hang around to dig out these silly documents and believe that is how India runs. I travel out and I very often see that thankfully Lutyens, Delhi, and Delhi has very little to do with how India runs. It runs despite Lutyens very often. It almost runs as if Lutyens doesn't exist. Sometimes Lutyens, Delhi, and this space argues and pushes back at that system and gets something out of them and makes their life miserable or happy. But most often people tend to kind of live on their own. It's a system which is slowly changing because there is a degree of aspiration in the new community. Do I have another 3-4 minutes before I shut up? 3 minutes? Okay. So there is a great aspiration in this society, and I think all of us in some way, me less because I'm now graying, but you a lot more, represent this aspiration society. You want to do more, as your faculty was saying me, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but that you guys have a lot of impatience. You want to change a lot, you want to study less and change a lot, which is fantastic in some ways. But I would just request, and I see this very often in myself as well, that this impatience needs to change a bit. It's not that you shouldn't have this impatience, but you should have this impatience for others less privileged than you. This impatience should be about requiring the same things for others rather than for yourself, realizing that you have enough already, in comparative terms. I'm not saying it's enough for what the world should be for you. The great opportunities beyond that you should investigate and reach out to. But this impatience somehow in our middle classes, and I am part of that, must shift with empathy and sympathy towards those who have less than us. And then this impatience is worth living. Then this impatience is worth studying with, investing in, and building something out of it. As journalists, at least that was the notion we were brought up with, that your job is to look out for others' lives. As I don't know how many of you read Express today morning and found that journalists seem to be also living their lives more busily than they should be. I don't know if you read Indian Express today, there was a story about how corporate paid off bureaucrats, politicians, journalists to get their work done. And before coming here, it was very busy. I was trying to get those papers, and I got those papers eventually. Now, the papers are only what's recorded in the company records. Nobody else has said otherwise whether they got it or not. So this is again still in the realm of imagination in some sense, because there's nobody who said, yes, we did. One of the journalists asked for a cab for a day from a corporate and said, can you provide me a car to go from here to there for a day? Now, roughly I was thinking this is like 800, 900 rupees a day. It's really not much. Why would a journalist and we get paid decently well, we don't get paid pittance like we used to be earlier. Why would a journalist want this? And it again brought me back to yesterday's conversation with this bureaucrat saying, le lete na, kya jata hai? Because you got very comfortable about yourself somehow. You think, nahi bhi hai, chal jayega, mil gaya to kya jata hai? The moment you change this impatience that you have and use it for others less privileged than you, it's perhaps more productive. When you use it only for yourself to say, damn it, 24 घंटे बिजली नहीं आ रही है, UPS चलाना पड़ रहा है, at the moment it's a bit tricky to use those lines. Considering you have 300 million people without electricity and you just wanting clean energy, clean air in Delhi, it's a questionable idea at the moment. There are 1.2 million people, I was told, who die prematurely because of air pollution, indoor air pollution across the country, mostly women and children, simply because they use cook stoves of firewood and they can't afford anything else, or we can't provide them anything else. At that moment, sometimes you feel very odd in summer sitting in Delhi, Barsati, and saying, Bijli chali gayi. Oh, damn it. Ab kya hoga? I would say, request that perhaps, and this is me condescending again, is that in your interrogations that you do, in your research that you do, you will very often look at very small questions to begin with. And it's very important that you dig them very deep. You dig them minutely, because that's the one that will bring out those anecdotes that bring humaneness to your ideas. That's the one that builds empathy, certain degree of stories in your heart about what you work with. But keep the larger perspective in space somehow. Do think of the macro pictures. Do think of, very often when we work as a journalist sitting in Delhi with bureaucrats and politicians, we forget the small people or the less privileged people. Sometimes I feel the academics forget, sitting in the small spaces, how difficult the job can be to manage a country of such disparities, such variegated societies, and such difficult circumstances at the moment. It's been much better than it was 20 years ago, and yet there's a lot to be done in this society. And you guys, sometimes will feel the frustration that not much is happening, simply because I feel that a lot of you people, especially people who work on these multidisciplinary areas, you guys are at the vanguard of society in some ways. You have the privilege of sitting back, looking at things from all the kind of perspectives. A bureaucrat can only see 6% growth hoga ke nahi hoga. I can only see corruption kaise roko. Another guy who's only in a village can only perhaps afford to say ki BPL card milega ke nahi milega. You as researchers are perhaps sitting at that front edge, who are seeing it from all perspectives and getting really irritated. Kuch ho nahi raha hai. Because you are the guys who are perhaps pushing the society to question itself more and more. You're the guys who are asking questions that were not asked perhaps 5 years ago. So sometimes your job is perhaps not to just get answers, but even to ask new questions. And as long as you do that, I'll come back and take stories from you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nitin. Fantastic talk. And I mean, in terms of the title itself, I think if you replace environment with, yeah. But if you replace environment with environmentalism, and that's, I think, captures much of what you were talking about in terms of, we consider ourselves environmentalists, but are we thinking about these questions that we still use energy, we still have an air conditioner running here, even though there was just a talk earlier about how terrible dams are.
They're not actually. Again, these are the questions that you need to ask. Are dams really that terrible? I mean, somebody who gets inundated by them perhaps is, but the fact, damn it, where do you produce energy out of otherwise?
Exactly. So,
Sorry.
I had a couple of questions. Maybe I can just lay it out and then we'll open it for others and collect a few questions, and then maybe you can respond. Couple of things I had to say. One, I'm curious about the world that you mentioned that you spend much of your time in, the Lutyens zone, and a specialized part of that, which is business standard, your offices. I'm curious as to what these larger, the environmental debate, what place does it have within that world? And I'm speaking also from this experience. Just yesterday, one colleague of ours in the business program in our university, he talked to me once about having just jointly having a course on social impact assessment. So I told him, listen, we already have a course on EIA, and SIA is part of that course. And then few days later he comes back to me and he says कि नहीं वो MBA में उनको EIA नहीं चाहिए, सिर्फ SIA चाहिए, तो वो course नहीं चलेगा. So it's like, first of all, that already displays something, and that they're even looking at perhaps environment as a in terms of business strategies, in terms of entrepreneurship, which that's a debate, that's a discourse that's very common in the US now, right? With green energy, and let's make money out of it. Of course, capitalism is great at both creating the problems and then supplying solutions to it also. So what is the thinking here in those terms? And a second one, in terms of what you were talking about earlier, in terms of dams or other power generation in the country, how is it, like we're talking about 100 gigawatts, we're talking about that scale of operation. At some point in the 80s and 90s, this whole decentralization discourse was very popular in terms of not just political, but energy decentralization also. Is that still part of the discussion at all? Are we talking about, or the scale has just shifted to these sorts of numbers and figures, and therefore capacities of generation? These are just a couple of things I had, but maybe we can collect a few questions on the floor.
Good evening, sir. I really appreciate the idea you have shared with us, and really, I mean, the people like you really required in this profession, media profession. Sir, my question. So my question is not directly connected with this seminar topic. It is a little bit different. I just want to, I'm last few months I have came closer with the media and just heard so many news and just gone through the recent controversy of Kejriwal and media. So I just wanted to ask a little question that how far media is doing its work in just taking good governance, social governance, environmental governance, and just supporting the honest politics in India. How far it is proving itself?
Silence. I'm presuming you're all stunned with like awesomeness rather than sleeping right now. So, in the reverse order, if I could take his question first, on how well is media doing what it's meant to do? I think pretty badly, honestly, very badly. The fact that I read it today and I saw that a business group which was trying to buy out a certain advantage from the government looked at politicians, journalists and bureaucrats almost with the same lens and treat them at par, suggested that we have become too close to par as a community. They're brilliant journalists within the thing. I think I've had the privilege of working with some excellent journalists as individuals, but as an institution, I think media is facing a crisis that it hasn't in the last long while. And it's very easy to see how society in general looks at journalists as either somebody who's very powerful or somebody who has information but doesn't respect them too much. And as the only two kinds of leaders, public leaders that you find, the leaders that you fear and leaders that you love. We've unfortunately become public leaders that people fear or look upon and say, oh, he's got connections, and we're not respected for what we say. And I think that's a clear indication that the profession per se is going down a line which is not healthy, needs to be corrected. Some of this churning comes because we're again part of the same society, we come from the same setup. Regardless, we've chosen a certain profession which requires a degree of at least self-belief, even if it's delusional that you were working for society. I think it's partly delusional. We all like to believe we're working for society, but I think we do tend to provide information. Therefore, it's important that we're at least cleaner in the way we do it, more professional. I think we're lacking that. But despite that, I must say, I've seen stellar work from areas and locations and in situations from journalists that is unbelievable. People who work against all circumstances, even their own bosses, their media houses and publishers to get out work. They're fantastic individuals. I think the institution of journalism is crumbling a bit and it needs a quick repair, just like a lot of other pillars of our society does at the moment. I would, on this issue of the business of environment and where the business world and how it looks at environment, maybe I'm colored because I've been sitting in Business Standard for a while, but let me try and give it an answer. I think it's slightly fallacious to imagine that there's only one kind of business, and that it's only the corporate world versus environment. Any decisions we take on environment or on resources ends up providing profits or taking away incomes from somebody or the other. These are trade-offs. Really, so if I said, if I'm going to move towards solar energy and move away from coal blocks, I'll still produce new entrepreneurs. I'll still produce perhaps new layers of corruption. new kinds of businesses that did not exist earlier. And I'll take away some of the old monopolies in some way. Even at a small level, when you look at, say, do you move from growing a certain NTFP to growing a plantation, there was still existing a Lala used to take out the NTFP and sell it at high margins in the cities. Now you'll have a new guy, maybe a paper pulp industry, who will take out the bamboo instead and sell it off. So I think there's always business interest in all resources. Somehow it's fallacious on our part not to realize that somebody's business is always involved in a resource. And you will always take out someone's business, and you will always add to someone's business with all the decisions that you take on resources. The question is, overall, does it produce a more distributive economy? Does it deepen your democracy in some sense? I think those are real questions in some sense. Sometimes I get worried about this debate about capitalism versus socialism. Really, all isms have used resources to generate a certain kind of society. What you're looking for is to perhaps produce a better society where the less privileged get better equitous deal out of those resources. And it will still require business in some sense. It may not be business with 5 corporate houses or 2 oligarchs. It might be with 40 businessmen. It might be one of us. For all you know, maybe tomorrow one of you guys would turn out to be the best users of a natural produce. Maybe use it best so that others earn out of it. I think the question to constantly keep asking is, are we using this resource well? Is there another way of using this resource? How much of it we need to conserve? In some sense, the question, as in climate change, is termed like this. It's called a question between intergenerational equity and intragenerational equity. How much do you conserve for future? But conserving for future comes at the cost of keeping some of the less privileged right now away from those resources. Because just because you reach there first, so say in this case, as you were saying, ACs, just because we've reached this point of consuming so much energy more, now we'll ask the less poor not to use so much energy because climate change will cause havoc and our next generation will not be able to afford a good life. So there are these debates of equity across time and equity across space. And I think those a democracy needs to engage, and then perhaps you'll get a better price. On the issue of decentralization of energy, it's still a pretty good movement. There is a lot of work being done, actually much more work being done than was being done, say, 10 years ago. The technology is improving, but there's something that can't be done even if you had the off-grid energy available. So off-grid basically is, can you put up something that doesn't need to come from a wire? You can put up over your house. A small village can set it up on its own and run it. It can generate, it provides a basic source of energy. But what do you do if, say, a village, after it's got that energy, wants to also set up a small-scale industry? Then what do you do? So there is a stage to which that is essential. And I think we are messing up that we are investing, again, as you're rightly saying, in this over-sexy 100 gigawatts number because it looks so nice. We're investing in this rather than investing in the off-grid things. Again, typically the issues around hydel, very similar. Can you do small hydel projects, micro hydels? Can you do gharats rather than do big hydros? Those are questions, again, simply, I mean, if you turn it into a journalistic story, it will be because big contracts come out of big projects. Dalali zyada hoti hai bade projects mein, chote mein kam hoti hai. It's as simple as that in some ways. So, and it turns into a policy question if I want to turn it more esoteric. So there is a space for both of these. There's space to work at a very small, micro level, decentralized level, make panchayats more powerful, give them more funds like the Finance Commission does this time, provide them more money, resources, choices, as I said, to screw themselves up in a unique way. And that needs to be done. I think that we've not given the chance to our community to find our unique ways of screwing ourselves up. We need to give that chance. And I think that will only help democracy. It will also help a lot of these questions of corruption, etc. And I very often, again, if I can end with an anecdote, one of my minister friends, who was a good friend and he passed away last year, and I kept on asking, he did a bit of decentralization in Madhya Pradesh, tried to pass over some of the funds to panchayats, eventually lost elections because of it. And I'm like, you lost elections because you gave money to the people. That's the idea of democracy. He says, but this is how it ends up. I'm the Thakur. I end up losing my entire Thakuran because I gave the money away. But what it really didn't, I said, but it didn't really work. There are no roads, no electricity at the end of the day in the area that you distributed money. He said, but why should I be bothered whether there were roads or not? I decentralized corruption. It's the first form of democracy. At least I'm not eating all the money. The panchayat head is eating today. Next time the Gram Sabha head will eat. Maybe after that the woman sarpanch will end up eating a bit. And eventually we'll also start building roads. So I think those questions of how do you decentralize and what do you mean by deepening democracies are part of these large, when you look at macro and micro somehow. I don't know if I'm making sense. Yeah.
Any further question? Yeah, no.
So I was wondering, and I don't know the answer to this, but is the only way to look at environment and nature is as a resource? Or because the moment you look at it only as a resource, then obviously, yes, it has to be appropriated, right? But is there, without, saying that, without monetizing it, and I'm thinking back again of Felix Padel's work on Odisha, where he gives, where he works with the tribal communities and their understanding of nature as sacred and also as something that they use for their everyday, but with, with greater care. So can we think of nature and environment in a different way or only as a resource?
It's a tricky question for me because I've always ended up fighting with all my friends who relatively are in the field of environmentalism or environment per se. Because I really do believe, perhaps myopically, and forgive me for that, that the moment you demonetize resource, you turn it into the area of aesthetics. And aesthetics comes from this place in society that you are. So I very often give the example of the tigers per se. Why does a certain society at certain time love tigers? There's no great value to them really, except for aesthetic value. And at a certain stage of life, if I'm economically deprived, I'll really give two hoots about a tiger if I could get 5 lakh rupees out of it. So a lot of these questions, when you turn them non-monetized in a fact that all these resources at some point in the time, even when you use them aesthetically, you appropriate them. Even when you present an aesthetic value to certain thing by saying it's a sacred grove, you still, in a way, have appropriated it from somebody or the other. Take the case of, say, the water bodies in Rajasthan, traditional water bodies. Fantastic traditional water bodies, water saving systems that were built up, and so many people have done their PhDs on it. But it all built on a caste system, which ensured that only a certain part of the community could create these, conserve these, and use them and license them the way they wanted. Now, and they all said it's very important for ecology. It was. It did create a certain ecology, but it also created divisions between society. So all these appropriations of sacredness, they're important for certain communities. Certain communities use them, is the only way of defending it against the upper caste. It's the only way of defending them against people who can economically appropriate them far easily. By demonetizing also, you create a certain degree of control over them. By saying, aur kuch nahi to bhagwan ke liye chhod do. I mean, that's a typical Hindi filmy line you've heard. So if you create sacredness around a resource, you also appropriate it economically for yourself. So some communities have no other option but to use these tools of social media, in some sense social explanation rather than economic explanation. But it's still being used. The fact that somebody doesn't use a piece of land is because there is certain advantage he or she derives out of it. And I come from a point where I see everyday governance is appropriating spaces, is distributing spaces, managing them in a certain way that they will be appropriated, regardless of whether you want or not. So if there's a sacred grove, there's still a government classification for sacred grove. It's still called wasteland. So as a person who has to engage in policy making on these issues, I cannot be blind to the fact that even a sacred grove has a monetary aspect to it, has an economic aspect to it. I mean, I maybe wrongly, but I also insist, I ask all my researcher friends to also, while you understand the sacred grove for its sacredness, do not forget at the same time there are 10 different powers still trying to make it unsacred. And the moment you see that contestation for a piece of land or a piece of resource, it's been appropriated by someone else. And this business of aesthetics is, I mean, it's no more, I think in your generation it's not so high. You guys, I saw the research you guys are doing is fantastic. I mean, we moved so far away from 20 years ago when all we were discussing were tigers. every bloody chap who was into environment was discussing tigers. And it was only about the middle class aesthetics at the end of the day. If you look at the top environmentalists in public domain from 10 years ago, they were all elites of the society. They were all Maharajas, well-connected bureaucrats, somebody who had access to Indira Gandhi, somebody who had access to Rajiv Gandhi, somebody who used to play golf with Rahul Gandhi. It was just this group. And they decided what was environmentalism. They decided what was environment. It's altered. Thankfully, because of you people and new churning, I'm so glad. My initial years in journalism when I was doing environment, bloody every 3 months I used to write a story on Valmiki Thapar. I was like, what the heck? Is this it? Like, will I spend my life writing on Valmiki Thapar and his big beard? And, there'd literally be now last 5 years when I've not written a word on him and I feel he's irrelevant. And it's because of people like you. You've asked new questions. You've appropriated, created new aesthetics as well as an economics about what is environment. What are those debates? What are the questions to be asked? And I think that's more important than this simple debate about, can we leave something alone? Because nothing in India, especially in India, there's no space to leave anything alone. We are the most densely populated country in terms of how our resources are used. It's impossible to leave any patch of this earth alone within the geographical boundary. You leave it alone because you can afford to, I think. Very often, we turn it into a question of art because I can afford to turn it into a question of art, and I can sit back and say, oh, poor tiger mar gaya. There's always more to the poor tiger dying. There's always a backstory which is driven by economics, social impacts, messing of people between themselves, a churning within society in something only from that point of view. You really need all economics, all writers, all researchers to think this is natural, to just think there are contestations between people about how resources are used, and that's it. If you do that well, anyone covering a good coal scam, I think is one of the best things that's happened to environment in long run.
Maybe one more question, last question. There you go.
So when you talk about sources of energy, nuclear, coal, dams, hydroelectric power, it's obvious that there are very, very difficult trade-offs that are involved. Now, as researchers, we are, at least I deal with much, much smaller things. Why does a person choose to migrate? Why does a forest official act in the way that? And my mind boggles at the complexity of the trade-offs involved. And one is really scared about who are the people who are making the decisions about these trade-offs. It's not a question, but I just want to get your sense on it. It's from where I work, these questions about 100 gigawatts of solar energy, and they really don't make even sense, the numbers.
I was hoping they don't make sense to you because just that they kind of hang in your head somewhere saying there's something troubling about this at some scale. As researchers, as writers also on an everyday basis, when you dig out a scam, you don't put it in perspective saying, nahi, scam nahi hota to coal nahi nikalta, isliye hone do. So you need to ask those questions. Now, in terms of, say, just the dams thing, to give you a perspective in some sense, this is the same bureaucrats who take these decisions also brought out this report a couple of months ago, which has still not been put in public domain, about who got displaced most by development in the last 30 years. And you find about 60 million people got displaced by different kind of development projects over the last 2 decades or so. Out of this, a majority were tribals and scheduled castes. Overwhelming majority. 60% of them were scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. And if you remember, scheduled tribes are only about 8% of the population. Yet, the calculations show that there's 1 in every 4 tribal born in India will get displaced in his or her lifetime by one or the other project. That's how difficult it is. So the question is not really, in that sense, is the dam going to be built or not? It's perhaps true that most of these lands which are resource rich are where the tribals are. I'm not going to debate about whether they preserved it, it got preserved, etc., etc. Whether they got a first chance, they would screw it up or not. I'm very happy if they got the chance, they should also screw it up like we did. The question is, how does the state deal with this issue? How does the state go and say, I'm going to take your land away? There is a question of eminent domain which is coming up with the Land Acquisition Act at the moment. can the state, which needs to do all this, go over and say, this thing is required for national interest, I shall take it over? And therefore, large questions about what is national interest. So when you go as a researcher in field, and I also face this because views, eventually, I don't know how many of you understand Hindi and how many don't, but in Hindi there's this term marmik. So my editor used to say, when you write these big esoteric stories about climate change, 30 years hence there'll be calamity, kuch marmik likho, kal kaun marega? Because otherwise, who the heck wants to read this nonsense? And it's very true. The first time I wrote like for 6 months climate change stories, the first reader reply I got was somebody from Pune saying, sir, aap green furniture bechenge mere liye? So there's a marmik kahani attached to all these. And in some sense, you face those stories. And if you don't ask those stories, then people sitting in Delhi will never have the right answers to give. Is these pinpricks, all of us are like small pinpricks, and especially people working in field, you are like small pinpricks. And policymakers are like large elephants walking all over you. So you'll feel really pissed off because nothing really happens. But if you don't pinprick them enough, they'll continue to walk in the same manner. So these questions that you interrogate saying, how many people do you displace? At what cost do you displace? Is there a more humane way of displacement? Or should there be no displacement? Who should decide these facts? Should a Gram Sabha have the power to say no to central government for a project? Say Vedanta. But if every Gram Sabha did that, then what would happen to all the projects? And where would the energy come from? Now, unfortunately, the way the power balance is right now, all the people who can say, yes, we should have it, seem to be in Delhi. All the people who say it shouldn't be so are sitting back in the villages, unfortunately. Therefore, it becomes your jobs to make sure their voices find spaces in either your academic work or your writings or your thoughts. So, a good democracy is about conflict. It's not about finding peace. It's about having a healthy fight out over issues where the less privileged over time gets a bit more chance to speak up in a different way than he or she did 10 years ago. I always find, I do a lot of work on climate change negotiations, takes me to these huge rooms filled up with thousands of bureaucrats sitting in suits discussing text, literally paragraphs, commas, semicolons for weeks. 3 days can be spent saying, shall we put the comma here or not? And that comma decides actually how much energy a country would get. So it's a very weird experience. Then you come out, and as you're saying, when I read work from researchers like you, and I say, damn it, somehow if my work doesn't connect that comma to this story, perhaps as a journalist I'm doing a bad job. So there's space for all these kind of writing. There's space for an idiot like me to understand the comma. There's space for you to also narrate the history of somebody who's going to get plowed under a huge dam somehow. I really don't think there's an answer. I don't think there is ever going to be a real solution in sense we'll have a perfect formula of how India should develop. But I think the better way to develop is that the less privileged next year gets a better chance than they get got last year. And that's the best a democracy can do.
That is a good note to end the plenary here. Thanks so much to Nitin Sethi for joining us today, and to all of you for making it through since 10 in the morning.